In the shadows of a nameless metropolis, a group of young people sought thrills beyond their mundane lives. Ignoring whispered warnings, they embarked on a dark journey through urban rituals, unaware that each step led them deeper into a labyrinth of horror from which they might never escape. The Black Cat was a run-down bar in the heart of the city's oldest district. Its flickering neon sign cast a red glow over the cracked sidewalk. On a particularly dark Friday night, 5 young people met here, each carrying the weight of their own expectations and fears. Mariana arrived first, her determined steps echoing down the nearly deserted street. At 23, she was the oldest and the most skeptical. A physics student, Mariana always sought rational explanations. However, an inexplicable event in her past led her to question everything she thought she knew about reality. She entered the bar, her dark eyes scanning the smoky environment. Lucas appeared next, his easy smile masking inner turmoil. At 20, he was the group's adventurer. The only child of absent parents, Lucas grew up seeking adrenaline in increasingly dangerous places. To him, urban rituals were just another challenge to overcome. Julia arrived carrying a heavy backpack, her glasses fogging up slightly as she entered the warm bar. At 19, she was the youngest, and ironically, the most knowledgeable about the occult. Raised by a grandmother who practiced folk magic, Julia always lived with one foot in each world. Her quest for knowledge led her to explore the darkest corners of the internet and libraries. Raphael entered hesitantly, looking over his shoulder as if he feared being followed. At 21, he was the most nervous of the group. Plagued by anxiety since childhood, Raphael saw the rituals as a way to face his deepest fears. Or perhaps, he thought, a way to prove that all his fears were unfounded. Finally, Carla pushed open the bar door, her determined gaze sweeping the room until she found the others. At 22, she had become the group's reluctant leader. A former cheerleader and current psychology student, Carla was always fascinated by the power of the human mind. She was the one who first suggested exploring the rituals, driven by a curiosity bordering on obsession. "Everyone here?" Carla asked, her voice low but firm, as she joined the others at a table in the back. "Last chance to back out," Lucas laughed, a forced sound that didn't reach his eyes. "And miss all the fun? No way." Julia opened her backpack, revealing ancient books and strange objects. "I found more information about the first ritual," she whispered, leaning over the table. "The abandoned subway station. It has a darker history than we imagined." Raphael swallowed hard, his fingers nervously drumming on the table. "What kind of history?" Mariana interrupted before Julia could respond. "It doesn't matter. They're just stories, urban legends. What matters is what we're going to do there." Carla nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and excitement. "Exactly. We're here to challenge the unknown, to see what lies beyond the veil of reality. Who's in?" One by one, they extended their hands, forming a circle in the center of the table. Even Raphael, after a moment of hesitation, joined the silent pact. "There's no turning back now," Carla declared, her voice barely a whisper. "At midnight, we meet at the entrance to the abandoned station, and may the gods help us with whatever we find down there." As the group dispersed, each preparing in their own way for the night to come, a shadowy figure watched them from the bar. His eyes, hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, gleamed with ancient knowledge. A crooked smile formed on his lips as he murmured to himself, "Ah, youth, so eager to dance with the shadows, little do they know that the shadows always lead the dance." Midnight approached as the 5 young people met again, this time before the sealed entrance of the old city subway station, abandoned for decades. The air was heavy, laden with the smell of mold and decay. Carla, with a flashlight in hand, illuminated the entrance. Everyone ready? Lucas, armed with a crowbar, attacked the rusty padlock, keeping the gate closed. With a metallic groan that seemed to echo through the silent night, the entrance gave way. "Last chance to turn back," Mariana murmured, her eyes scanning the tense faces of her companions. No one moved. With a nod, Carla led the group into the darkness. The descent seemed endless. Steps covered in trash and debris creaked underfoot. The walls, once white, were now covered in faded graffiti and moisture stains that seemed to form tortured faces in the dim light. Upon reaching the platform, the group stopped, stunned by the vastness of the dark space. Dark tunnels stretched in both directions, their black mouths seeming to swallow all light. Julia opened her backpack, taking out the items needed for the ritual. "We need to form a circle here," she instructed, her voice trembling slightly. "Use the chalk to draw specific symbols at each cardinal point." As they worked, Raphael couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, certain he had seen movement in the depths of the tunnels. With the circle complete, Julia lit the black candles, their faint glow casting dancing shadows on the station walls. "Now," she whispered, "we must recite the invocation. Remember, no matter what happens, do not leave the circle." The ancient words echoed through the abandoned station, a cacophony of guttural syllables that seemed to cut through the very air. As the chant grew in intensity, the air around them began to move, first a gentle breeze, then a howling wind that threatened to extinguish the candles. Suddenly, a deafening roar shook the platform. The ground trembled, and cracks began to form in the concrete, radiating from the center of the circle. "Don't stop!" Julia shouted over the noise, her eyes wide with fear and excitement. Then they saw it. In the shadows beyond the circle, something moved. It wasn't solid or liquid, but a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to absorb all light. Tendrils of shadow stretched toward the circle, testing its limits. Raphael screamed, his fear finally overcoming his determination. He turned to run, breaking the circle's formation. "Raphael, no!" Carla screamed. But it was too late. The moment the circle was broken, the darkness surged forward. In an instant, it enveloped Raphael, who let out a scream of absolute terror before being completely consumed by the shadowy mass. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The wind ceased, the shadows retreated, and silence reigned once more in the abandoned station. But Raphael was gone. The four remaining young people looked at each other, pale and trembling. The horror of what they had witnessed and what they had done began to sink in. "What happened?" Lucas stammered. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. Julia, tears in her eyes, shook her head. "I don't know. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this." Mariana, always the rational one, tried to stay calm. "We have to find him. He must be somewhere here in the station." But Carla, looking at the shadows that seemed denser and more threatening than ever, knew deep down that Raphael was no longer there. "Not in this world, at least. What have we done?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "My God, what have we done?" As the group huddled together, seeking comfort and protection, none of them noticed the shadowy figure standing at the platform's entrance. The same man from the bar watched the scene with a crooked smile, his eyes gleaming with ancient and terrible knowledge. "The pact is sealed," he murmured to himself. And now the real game begins. The days following Raphael's disappearance were a blur of fear, guilt, and despair for the remaining four young people. Unable to report the incident to the authorities without implicating themselves, they found themselves trapped in a spiral of paranoia and anxiety. Carla, consumed by guilt for leading the group into this fatal endeavor, could barely sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Raphael's terrified face being swallowed by darkness. She knew they needed answers, not just to try and save Raphael, but to understand what they had unleashed. A week after the incident, the group met again, this time in Julia's cramped apartment. The place was a mess, piles of old books and printouts from obscure web pages covering every available surface. "I found something," Julia said, her eyes red from sleepless nights. She pointed to a dusty book, its pages yellowed with age. "The old city station. It has a much darker history than we imagined." Mariana leaned in to see better, her skepticism giving way to morbid curiosity. "What did you find?" Julia flipped through the book until she reached a marked page. According to this record, the station was built over the ruins of an ancient pagan temple. During the excavations, workers found strange artifacts and human remains in ritualistic configurations. Lucas, who had been pacing nervously, stopped. "Wait, you're saying we performed our ritual on top of a site already loaded with negative energy?" Julia nodded grimly. "Worse. Apparently, there was a series of unexplained disappearances during the station's construction. Workers reported hearing voices from the tunnels, seeing shadows where there shouldn't be any." "Why was the station closed?" Carla asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Officially? Structural issues," Julia replied. "But there are rumors of a terrible accident. Dozens of passengers disappeared in a single day, simply vanished. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with terrible implications. It was Mariana who finally broke the silence. We need more information. Someone who knows more about the city's hidden history." As if responding to an unspoken call, there was a knock at the door. The four exchanged glances, none of them expecting visitors. Cautiously, Carla opened the door. Outside stood an elderly man, his wrinkled face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His deep, dark eyes seemed to hold the knowledge of ages. "You called for me," he said, his voice gravelly, like stones grinding together. We didn't call anyone," Lucas stammered, instinctively taking a step back. The old man smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, but you did. Perhaps not with words, but with actions. You opened a door, children, and now you need to learn how to close it." He entered the apartment uninvited, his eyes scanning the books and papers strewn about. "I see you've already started your research. Good. You'll need all the knowledge you can get." Carla, recovering from the initial shock, stepped forward. "Who are you? What do you know about what happened?" The old man turned to her, his piercing eyes seeming to see through her soul. "My name is Ezekiel, and what do I know? I know that you played with forces beyond your comprehension. I know that you opened a portal to a place that should never be disturbed. And I know that your friend, well, he's no longer in this plane of existence." Julia gasped, her hands trembling as she clutched one of the books to her chest like a shield. "Can you help us bring him back?" Ezekiel laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Bring him back? Child, the question isn't bringing your friend back. The question is stopping what took him from coming here." He moved to the center of the room, his presence suddenly seeming to fill the entire space. "You started something, an ancient, dangerous ritual, and now the barriers between worlds are weakened. If they are not sealed again—" He left the sentence hanging, the silence more terrifying than any words could be. "What can we do?" Mariana asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay composed. Ezekiel smiled again, his eyes gleaming with terrible knowledge. "Ah, that's the right question. And the answer? Well, the answer will cost you dearly, very dearly. As the young people exchanged glances, a mixture of fear and determination on their faces, Ezekiel continued, "But first you need to fully understand what you've unleashed, and for that, we need to visit certain places where the boundary between worlds is thinnest." Carla, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, stepped forward. "We'll do whatever it takes to save Raphael and to fix what we've done." Ezekiel nodded, a grim expression on his face. "Very well. Prepare yourselves. The journey ahead will be dangerous, and not all of you may survive it." With those words, the air in the apartment seemed to grow heavier, laden with the promise of horrors yet unseen. The four young people looked at each other, knowing they had reached a point of no return. Whatever came next, their lives would never be the same. The full moon hung in the night sky like a watchful eye as the group gathered at the abandoned house, on the outskirts of the city. Ezekiel had led them there, claiming the place was a convergence point of mystical energies. The house, a dilapidated Victorian mansion, seemed to writhe under the moonlight, its shadows dancing in unnatural ways. The broken windows were like gaping mouths ready to swallow the unwary. "This place," Ezekiel murmured, his rough voice cutting through the night silence, "has witnessed many tragedies. The veil between worlds is thin here." Carla, Lucas, Mariana, and Julia exchanged nervous glances. In the 2 weeks since Raphael's disappearance, they had delved into a world of forbidden knowledge and unimaginable horrors under Ezekiel's guidance. Each of them bore the marks of this journey, deep circles under their eyes, trembling hands, and haunted looks. "The ritual of the broken mirror," Julia recited, her voice trembling slightly, "will allow us to see beyond the veil and theoretically locate Raphael." Ezekiel nodded grimly. "But remember, children, looking beyond the veil has a price, and we don't always get to choose who pays it." The group entered the house, the floorboards groaning underfoot, as if alive. In the main room, they set up the ritual. A large oval mirror, cracked from top to bottom, was placed in the center of a circle of black candles. "Each of you must stand at a cardinal point," Ezekiel instructed. "When the clock strikes midnight, we will begin the invocation." The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. When the old house's clock finally struck 12, its notes echoing unnaturally through the empty structure, the group began to recite the words Ezekiel had taught them. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with static electricity. The candle flames flickered and elongated, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the mirror began to glow with a sickly green light. The crack in the center seemed to expand, revealing not a reflection, but an alien and terrifying landscape. "Raphael!" Carla screamed, her eyes wide with horror and hope as she saw a familiar figure writhing in the distance. But before anyone could react, something changed. The mirror's light pulsed, and an invisible force seemed to pull them toward its gleaming surface. Lucas, the closest to the mirror, screamed as his hand touched the surface. Instead of finding resistance, his fingers sank into it like liquid mercury. "Help me!" he shouted, struggling to pull away. Mariana and Julia ran to help him, grabbing his arms and pulling with all their strength. For a terrible moment, it seemed that Lucas would be swallowed by the mirror. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, he was thrown back, collapsing onto the girls. But something was terribly wrong. Where his hand had touched the mirror, the skin was changed, darkened and twisted as if burned by a cold fire. And his eyes were completely black, with no visible iris or sclera. "Lucas," Julia stammered. Recoiling in horror, Lucas stood up slowly, his movements strange and disjointed. When he spoke, his voice was a guttural, inhuman sound. Lucas is no longer here. The thing that was no longer. Lucas growled. Ezekiel cursed, moving with surprising agility for his age. He threw a glittering powder in Lucas's face, shouting words in an ancient and forgotten language. Lucas, or whatever was using his body, screamed. A sound of pure agony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Then, like a puppet with its strings cut, he collapsed to the floor. "What happened?" Carla demanded, her face pale with shock. "What did we do?" Ezekiel turned to her, his eyes shining with a mix of fear and resignation. "What you did? You opened a door, child, and now they are coming in." The candle flames flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. In the silence that followed, they could hear something scratching the walls, whispering in the dark corners, getting closer. Mariana, her voice trembling with terror, whispered what they were all thinking. "What have we brought into our world?" Ezekiel, his figure silhouetted against the ghostly light of the broken mirror, answered with a voice heavy with foreboding. "The end, unless we can stop it." And in the shadows of the abandoned house something laughed, a sound of malignant joy that promised horrors beyond human imagination. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning herbs in Ezekiel's small apartment. 3 days had passed since the disastrous broken mirror ritual, and the group was on the brink of collapse. Lucas lay on a worn sofa, his skin still marked by strange, dark scars, muttering incoherently in a language no one recognized. Julia stayed by his side, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. Carla paced back and forth, her mind a storm of guilt and determination. Mariana sat silently in a corner, frantically flipping through old books, desperately searching for answers. Ezekiel emerged from his room, carrying a carved wooden chest, so ancient it seemed ready to disintegrate at the touch. "It is time," he said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, "for you to know the whole truth." The old man placed the chest on a low table and opened it carefully. From inside he took out a yellowed parchment, covered in strange and unsettling symbols. "This document," Ezekiel began, "is the record of a pact made millennia ago, long before this city existed, long before our civilization even dreamed of being." Carla approached, her wide eyes fixed on the parchment. "What kind of pact?" "A pact between our world and another," Ezekiel replied, his voice heavy with ancient weight. "An agreement to keep separate the realities that should never touch." Mariana abruptly stood, her skepticism giving way to reverent fear. "You're saying there is a cosmic agreement to keep entities from other dimensions away from our world?" Ezekiel nodded gravely. "Exactly. And you unknowingly began to undo that pact." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Lucas's incoherent murmurs. "For millennia," Ezekiel continued, "there have been guardians, people chosen to maintain the balance, to ensure that the portals remained closed. I am the last of them." Julia gasped, comprehension dawning in her eyes. "The subway station, the abandoned house, they're all weak points in the barrier between worlds, aren't they?" "Yes," Ezekiel confirmed. "And there are others, scattered throughout the city, throughout the world, points where reality is thin, where the barriers can be broken." Carla took a step forward, determination shining in her eyes. "How can we fix this? How do we close the portals we've opened?" Ezekiel smiled sadly. "It's not that simple, child. The pact is unraveling. And the entities on the other side, they're hungry for our world, our souls." He unrolled more of the parchment, revealing a series of complex symbols. "This is the original ritual, the one that sealed the pact, for the first time. But to perform it, the price is high." "What price?" Mariana asked, dreading the answer. "A life," Ezekiel replied, somberly, "voluntarily sacrificed to reinforce the barriers." The shock of the revelation weighed heavily on the group. The implication was clear. To fix what they had broken, one of them would have to die. At that moment, Lucas sat up abruptly, his eyes completely black, fixed on the parchment. When he spoke, his voice was a grotesque mix of his normal tone and something else. "They know," he growled. "They are coming." As if to confirm his words, a tremor shook the building. Outside, sirens began to wail, and distant screams could be heard. Ezekiel moved with surprising speed, throwing the parchment back into the chest and closing it. "We don't have much time," he said urgently. "Your choice must be made now. We perform the ritual and seal the portals, sacrificing a life, or what?" Julia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ezekiel's gaze was grim. "Or we witness the end of everything we know." Another tremor, stronger this time. The lights flickered, and for a moment impossible shadows danced on the walls. Carla looked at her friends, the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. "What do we do now?" The question hung in the air, laden with fear, guilt, and a terrible responsibility. As chaos unfolded outside, the 5 young people and the old guardian faced an impossible choice. The fate of the world, sealed millennia ago by an ancestral pact, now rested in their trembling hands. The city was in chaos. Sirens wailed incessantly, mingling with the screams of terror echoing through the streets. In the sky, dark clouds writhed into impossible shapes, occasionally revealing glimpses of a starless void that should not exist in our world. Ezekiel led the group through the panicked streets, his face a mask of grim determination. Carla, Mariana, and Julia followed closely, with Lucas between them, still muttering incoherently, his black eyes fixed on unseen horrors. "Where are we going?" Carla shouted, over the city's collapsing cacophony. "To where it all began," Ezekiel replied, his voice laden with foreboding. "The old city station, the focal point of all the portals." They moved quickly, avoiding panicked crowds and other things, shadows that moved against the wind, tendrils of darkness stretching from alleyways, and occasionally creatures that defied sanity, glimpsed only for a moment before disappearing back into the chaos. Finally, they reached the entrance to the abandoned station. The air around it vibrated with palpable, malevolent energy, and the darkness inside seemed deeper, more alive than should be possible. "Hurry!" Ezekiel commanded, pushing them inside. "We don't have much time." They descended the stairs, the light from their flashlights dancing wildly on the walls. The platform was as they had left it weeks ago, but now there was something more, an oppressive presence that made their stomachs churn. With primal fear, Ezekiel quickly began preparing the ritual, drawing complex symbols on the ground with consecrated chalk, positioning black candles and scattering herbs that crackled and smoked as they touched the floor. "The portal is almost fully open," he said, his voice trembling for the first time since they'd met him. "We can feel the other side now, trying to force its way into our world," Lucas suddenly screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the empty station. His body began to contort, his skin bubbling and shifting, as if something was trying to break free from within him. "Lucas!" Julia ran to him, but Ezekiel held her back. "No! He's beyond our help now. Whatever came through the mirror, it's taking full control." Carla, tears streaming down her face, took a step forward. "What do we have to do?" Ezekiel looked at each of them, his ancient eyes filled with sorrow and resolve. "The ritual requires a voluntary sacrifice, a pure soul freely given, to reseal the barriers between the worlds. A heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by Lucas's agonized moans. "I'll do it," Mariana said suddenly, her voice firm, despite the fear in her eyes. "I started this. I was the skeptic, the one who pushed us to go further. It's only right that I finish it." "No!" Carla and Julia shouted in unison, but Ezekiel silenced them with a look. "The choice must be hers," he said solemnly. "And we must hurry. The veil is tearing." As if to emphasize his words, a deafening roar echoed through the station, the air filled with static electricity, and shadows began to move and writhe on the walls, taking on increasingly solid and terrifying forms. Ezekiel quickly positioned Mariana in the center of the ritual circle. "Repeat after me," he instructed, beginning to chant words in an ancient and terrible language. As Mariana repeated the chant, her voice trembling but determined, the air around her began to glow with an ethereal light. Carla and Julia watched in horror and awe as the ritual's energy grew. Lucas let out another inhuman scream, and to everyone's horror, his body began to disintegrate, turning into a mass of shadows and tentacles, writhing on the floor. "Don't stop!" Ezekiel shouted over the growing chaos. "The portal is closing." The light around Mariana intensified until it became almost blinding. She screamed not in pain, but in a kind of terrible ecstasy, as her body seemed to dissolve into pure energy. At that moment, the thing that had been Lucas attacked, launching itself at the barrier of light. Ezekiel threw himself in its path, shouting words of power that made the air vibrate. For a terrible moment it seemed that all was lost. Darkness fought against light, threatening to consume everything. Then, with a deafening explosion that shook the very foundations of reality, a wave of energy blasted from the center of the ritual. Carla and Julia were thrown against the walls, momentarily blinded and deafened. When they finally managed to stand, trembling and disoriented, the scene before them was one of total devastation. The ritual circle was burned into the concrete floor. There was no sign of Mariana, Lucas, or the creature he had become. Ezekiel lay on the ground, his breathing weak and irregular. Carla ran to him, holding his hand. "Did it work?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Ezekiel opened his eyes, a weak smile on his lips. "Yes," he whispered. "The portal is closed, the pact is renewed, but the cost—" His voice failed, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "And now?" Julia asked, joining them. "What do we do?" Ezekiel squeezed Carla's hand. "Now you become the guardians. The knowledge, the responsibility is yours now." With those words, his eyes closed for the last time. Carla and Julia looked at each other, the weight of all they had experienced and learned pressing down on them. Outside, they could hear the city slowly returning to normal, unaware of the apocalypse that had nearly occurred. "Let's go," Carla said finally, standing up. "We have work to do." As they left the station, carrying Ezekiel's body and the knowledge of ancient and terrible secrets, they both knew their lives would never be the same. The world had been saved, but at a terrible cost, and now it was up to them to ensure that the horror they had faced remained just a scary story and did not become reality again. The city began to slowly recover from the chaos that nearly consumed it. The authorities and ordinary citizens, unaware of the supernatural events that almost destroyed everything, tried to rebuild their lives. However, for the survivors of the urban rituals, life would never be the same. The survivors and their traumas, Carla and Julia. Now the new guardians of the Pact carried the weight of their experiences and the lost lives. The physical scars would heal over time, but the emotional ones would remain. Each night was haunted by visions of Mariana and Lucas, their faces distorted by the terror they faced. Carla, who once led the group with confidence, now struggled with overwhelming guilt. She spent hours reviewing Ezekiel's ancient scrolls, determined to better understand the Pact and ensure that nothing like this would happen again. Her nights were interrupted by nightmares where she relived the final moments of the rituals, Mariana's sacrifice, and Lucas's transformation. Julia, on the other hand, delved even deeper into the occult. The desire to fully understand what they had faced became an obsession. Her relentless quest for knowledge led her to connect with other scholars of the supernatural, forming a secret network that worked to monitor and protect other weak points in the barrier between worlds. The city changed forever. Although most citizens were unaware of the terror that nearly consumed them, something in the city had changed. The nights seemed darker. The whispers of the wind carried a tone of warning, and even the animals seemed restless. Rumors began to circulate about inexplicable disappearances and visions of shadows moving against the wind. The old city subway station was officially sealed again, this time with the help of authorities who cited structural safety reasons. But those who knew the truth understood that it was an effort to keep the evil contained. The dark legacy that remains in the urban shadows, the knowledge of the Pact and the rituals, became a somber responsibility for Carla and Julia. They were now the protectors of secrets that could mean the difference between peace and absolute chaos. In a final act of tribute, Carla and Julia buried Ezekiel next to the subway station, marking the spot with ancient protective symbols. The improvised cemetery became a place of respect and reflection for them, a constant reminder of the price of knowledge and the responsibility they now carried. As the city continued to move forward, the legacy of the urban rituals remained in the shadows. Carla and Julia knew their battle was far from over. They maintained constant vigilance, ready to face any sign that the veil between worlds was weakening again. In their daily lives, they tried to find moments of normalcy, but the weight of what they knew always hung over them. The secret network they formed grew, bringing with it new hope that they could prevent future catastrophes. The world had been saved, but at a terrible cost. And as long as there were guardians like Carla and Julia, there was hope that the balance between worlds could be maintained. For now, more than ever, they understood that the true terror was not in the shadows but in the unknown, lurking beyond them. The story of Pact with the unknown, urban rituals gone wrong, is a grim reminder of the dangers that lurk at the edges of reality. Knowledge and curiosity can open doors that should never be opened, and the price to pay can be too high. Carla and Julia, transformed by their experiences, dedicate their lives to protecting the world from the unknown. And as long as there are vigilant guardians, there is hope that the balance can be maintained, and the horrors from the other side remain just scary stories whispered in the dark. Until the next night of terror,